The morning mist clung to the Afghan mountains like a shroud, masking the movements of both hunter and hunted. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera adjusted his scope, watching the valley below through the crosshairs of his M107 Barrett rifle. The weight of the weapon felt familiar in his hands, a comfort he had grown accustomed to during his 3 tours in this unforgiving terrain. Rivera had earned his place among the Navy SEALs through years of grueling training and combat experience. Born in a small Texas town where hunting was a way of life, he had developed an almost supernatural ability with a rifle. His instructors at sniper school called it a gift, but Marcus knew it was more than that. It was dedication, discipline, and an unwavering focus that had been forged in the crucible of countless missions. The intelligence briefing from the night before still echoed in his mind. A high-value target had been spotted in the region. A Taliban commander known only as the Shadow. This man had been responsible for coordinating attacks against American forces for over 2 years, always staying one step ahead of capture. The locals whispered his name with a mixture of fear and reverence, speaking of his ability to disappear into the mountains like smoke. What made the Shadow particularly dangerous was not just his tactical brilliance, but his network of informants and his reputation for brutal retaliation against anyone who crossed him. He had turned entire villages into his eyes and ears, creating a web of surveillance that made conventional operations nearly impossible. The enemy forces under his command operated with a fearlessness that came from absolute loyalty or absolute terror. Rivera's spotter, Petty Officer Jake Thompson, lay beside him scanning the area with his binoculars. Thompson was young, barely 23, but he had proven himself reliable under fire. The 2 men had worked together for 8 months, developing the kind of wordless communication that kept snipers alive in hostile territory. "Movement, 2 o'clock, Thompson whispered, his voice barely audible even at close range. Rivera shifted his position slightly, bringing his scope to bear on the indicated area. Through the magnification, he could see figures moving along a mountain path about 800 meters away. They moved with purpose, not the casual gait of civilians going about their daily business. The squad of Taliban fighters numbered about 12 men, all armed with AK-47 seconds and RPGs. They moved in a tactical formation that spoke of military training and experience. Rivera watched them through his scope, noting their equipment and behavior. These were not the usual local fighters they sometimes encountered. These men were professionals, hardened veterans of the ongoing conflict. As the group moved closer to the village of Coast, Rivera felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Intelligence had indicated that the Shadow was planning something significant in this area, and the presence of these elite fighters suggested that the operation was already in motion. The village of Coast sat in a valley surrounded by steep hills and rocky outcroppings. It was home to about 300 people, mostly farmers and their families who had been caught in the crossfire of war for years. The village elder, Ahmad Hassan, had been secretly cooperating with American forces, providing intelligence about Taliban movements in exchange for protection and medical supplies for his people. Rivera remembered meeting Hassan during a previous mission. The old man had lost 2 sons to Taliban execution, accused of being American sympathizers. Despite this tragedy, or perhaps because of it, Hassan continued to provide information that had saved countless American lives. The intelligence network he had carefully built within his own community was invaluable to ongoing operations in the region. Through his scope, Rivera watched as the Taliban squad approached the village outskirts. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive red beard, was checking what appeared to be a handheld GPS device. Rivera had seen this man before in intelligence photos. His name was Rashid al-Mansouri, one of the Shadow's most trusted lieutenants. The presence of al-Mansouri in this area was significant. He was known for his role in planning and executing revenge attacks against civilians who cooperated with American forces. If he was here, it meant that the Shadow had discovered Hassan's cooperation with the Americans. Rivera felt his jaw tighten as he realized what was about to unfold. The Taliban fighters were not here for a routine patrol or to establish a temporary position. They were here to make an example of Hassan and his village, to send a message that would echo throughout the region about the price of cooperation with foreign forces. The radio crackled softly in Rivera's ear. "Overwatch, this is base. We have confirmation that package is in your area. Repeat, Package is mobile in your sector. Package was the code name for the shadow. Rivera's pulse quickened as he scanned the area more intensively. If the shadow was indeed in the vicinity, this operation was about to become much more significant than a simple reconnaissance mission. Thompson tapped Rivera's shoulder and pointed toward a cluster of rocks about 50 meters behind the Taliban squad. Through the scope, Rivera could just make out the figure of a man in traditional Afghan dress. But there was something different about him. While the other fighters moved with the casual confidence of men in familiar territory, this figure moved with the calculated precision of someone accustomed to command. The shadow had finally emerged from his hiding place. Rivera studied the target through his scope, noting every detail. The man was older than most of the fighters, probably in his 40s. With graying hair, visible beneath his traditional pakol hat, he carried himself with an authority that was unmistakable, even at a distance. This was a man who was used to being obeyed without question. As Rivera watched, the shadow raised a radio to his lips and began speaking. Almost immediately, the Taliban squad below changed their formation, spreading out to surround the village from multiple directions. It was clear that this was not a spontaneous operation but a carefully planned assault. The sniper felt the familiar calm that came over him before engaging a target. His breathing slowed, his heart rate steadied, and the world around him seemed to narrow to the small circle visible through his scope. He had made this shot countless times before, but never with stakes this high. The shadow represented more than just another high-value target. He was the architect of a campaign of terror that had claimed dozens of American lives and hundreds of Afghan civilian casualties. His death would not only remove a dangerous enemy commander, but would also deal a significant blow to Taliban operations in the entire region. Rivera adjusted his scope for distance and wind conditions. The shot would be challenging but well within his capabilities. At just over 900 meters, with minimal wind and clear visibility, the conditions were actually favorable for precision shooting. But as Rivera settled into his firing position, something unexpected happened. The shadow seemed to sense the danger and suddenly dropped behind the rocks, disappearing from view. It was as if he had developed a sixth sense for survival that had kept him alive through years of warfare. Rivera cursed silently, maintaining his position while scanning for another opportunity. Thompson continued his watch, noting the positions of all visible enemy fighters. The Taliban squad had now completely surrounded the village and was beginning to move in from all directions. Through his scope, Rivera could see villagers beginning to emerge from their homes, unaware of the danger approaching from the hills. Children played in the dusty streets, while women hung laundry to dry in the morning sun. The normalcy of the scene made what was about to happen even more tragic. The radio crackled again. Overwatch. We have eyes on civilians in target area. Rules of engagement remain in effect. Avoid civilian casualties at all costs. Rivera acknowledged the transmission while continuing to search for the shadow. The rules of engagement meant that he could not take shots that might endanger innocent civilians, which significantly limited his options given the proximity of the Taliban fighters to the village. As the minutes passed, the tactical situation continued to evolve. The Taliban fighters had now taken up positions around the village perimeter, effectively cutting off all escape routes. Their movements were coordinated and professional, suggesting extensive planning and reconnaissance. Rivera watched through his scope as al-Mansouri approached the village center, where a small group of elders had gathered near the mosque. The Taliban lieutenant was holding what appeared to be photographs, and Rivera realized with growing dread that these were likely surveillance photos of Hassan meeting with American forces. The trap had been set with meticulous care, and Hassan and his people were walking directly into it. Rivera found himself in the position that every sniper dreaded, having the ability to see disaster approaching but being unable to prevent it due to tactical constraints. Thompson was monitoring radio traffic from other units in the area, but the nearest support was at least 30 minutes away. Any rescue operation would arrive too late to prevent the massacre that was about to unfold in the village below. Rivera made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than wait for a clear shot at the shadow, he would have to act to protect the innocent civilians who were about to become victims of Taliban brutality. The mission parameters were about to change from reconnaissance to active intervention. The sniper shifted his aim to al-Mansouri, who was now in the village center interrogating the village elders. Through his scope, Rivera could see the Taliban lieutenant gesturing angrily while showing the photographs to the terrified civilians. Rivera's finger found the trigger as he prepared to take a shot that would save lives but potentially compromise the larger mission. The weight of command decisions in combat had never felt heavier than it did in that moment. Perched on a mountainside, with the power of life and death in his hands. The wind had picked up slightly, requiring a minor adjustment to his aim point. Rivera compensated automatically. His training, taking over as conscious thought, gave way to muscle memory and instinct. In the crosshairs of his scope, al-Mansuri continued his interrogation. Unaware that death was watching him from the mountains above, the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist and leaving the sniper fully exposed on his rocky perch. Rivera knew that his position would soon become untenable, as the improved visibility made concealment more difficult. If he was going to act, it had to be now. Through his scope, he watched as Hassan was forced to his knees in the village center, surrounded by Taliban fighters, with their weapons trained on the growing crowd of villagers. The old man's dignity remained intact despite his fear, and Rivera felt a surge of respect for the Afghan elder, who had risked everything to help American forces. Al-Mansuri raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Hassan's head, while continuing to shout questions that Rivera could not hear from his distant position. The intent was clear. This was going to be a public execution designed to terrorize the entire community into absolute submission. Rivera took a deep breath and began his final preparations for the shot that would announce his presence to every enemy fighter in the valley. Once he pulled that trigger, there would be no going back. The mission would transform from covert observation to active combat, with all the chaos and uncertainty that such a change entailed. The crosshairs settled on their target as Rivera prepared to engage an enemy who had no idea that his life was measured in heartbeats. In the village below, Hassan closed his eyes and began what appeared to be a final prayer, while his family and friends watched in helpless horror. The moment stretched endlessly as Rivera's world narrowed to the simple mechanical action of applying pressure to a metal trigger. Everything that had led him to this point, years of training, months of preparation, and a lifetime of choices, had culminated in this single instant of decision. Al-Mansuri's finger tightened on his own trigger as he prepared to execute Hassan in front of the assembled villagers. The Taliban lieutenant's expression was one of cold satisfaction, as he savored his moment of absolute power over life and death. Rivera's breathing stopped as he reached the final pressure point on his trigger. Time seemed suspended as the sniper prepared to announce his presence to an enemy force that outnumbered him 12-1, in terrain where escape would be nearly impossible. The morning air was still and clear, perfect conditions for precision shooting. In his scope, al-Mansuri's head filled the crosshairs, unaware that judgment was about to arrive from the mountains at over 2,000 feet per second. The Barrett rifle's report echoed across the valley like thunder, shattering the morning stillness and announcing the presence of American forces to every Taliban fighter within miles. Al-Mansuri dropped instantly, his body crumpling to the dust as the .50 caliber round found its mark with devastating precision. For a moment, the village square was frozen in shocked silence. The gathered villagers stared at the fallen Taliban lieutenant, while his fighters looked around wildly, trying to determine the source of the shot. Hassan remained on his knees, alive, but stunned by his sudden reprieve from execution. Rivera was already cycling the bolt on his rifle, ejecting the spent brass and chambering a fresh round. Through his scope, he watched the remaining Taliban fighters scatter for cover, their disciplined formation dissolving into chaos as they realized they were under attack from a concealed position. "Contact! Sniper fire from the North Ridge," Thompson reported into his radio while scanning the area with his binoculars. One enemy Kia, 11 remaining hostiles taking cover in the village. The radio crackled with acknowledgments from base and confirmation that quick reaction force was mobilizing, but Rivera knew they were at least 25 minutes away. He and Thompson would have to hold their position and protect the civilians until reinforcements arrived. Through his scope, Rivera tracked the movement of Taliban fighters as they sought shelter behind buildings and walls. These were experienced warriors who recovered quickly from surprise, and they were already beginning to organize a response to the sniper attack. Several fighters were moving to flank positions while others attempted to identify Rivera's location. The shadow had disappeared completely after al-Mansuri's death, melting away into the rocky terrain with the skill that had kept him alive for years. Rivera cursed the missed opportunity but focused on the immediate threat to the villagers who were now caught in the crossfire. Hassan had finally moved from his exposed position in the village center, helping to shepherd civilians toward the relative safety of the mosque. The old man's composure under fire was remarkable, and Rivera could see him organizing the evacuation with calm efficiency, despite the bullets that were now flying through the streets. A muzzle flash caught Rivera's attention from a window about 400 meters away. A Taliban fighter had set up a firing position and was spraying automatic fire toward the ridge where Rivera was concealed. The bullets struck rocks nearby, sending chips of stone flying but falling short of the sniper's position. Rivera adjusted his aim and fired again, the heavy rifle bucking against his shoulder. The shot shattered the window frame, but the Taliban fighter had already moved to another position. These were not the amateur fighters that American forces sometimes encountered. These men knew how to fight and survive in mountain terrain. Movement on the eastern approach, Thompson reported. 3 hostiles moving to flank our position. Range approximately 600 meters. Rivera swung his rifle toward the new threat, acquiring the lead fighter in his scope. The Taliban soldiers were moving with tactical precision, using cover and concealment as they worked their way up the steep slope. They had identified the general area of the sniper's position and were moving to eliminate the threat. The shot was more difficult this time, with the targets moving at an angle across uneven terrain. Rivera led his target slightly, compensating for the man's movement and the effect of gravity on the bullet's trajectory. The rifle thundered again, and the lead Taliban fighter tumbled down the rocky slope. The remaining 2 fighters immediately dove for cover, but their position was now exposed on the open mountainside. Rivera could see them clearly through his scope as they tried to find shelter among the scattered boulders and scrub vegetation. Thompson was monitoring multiple radio frequencies, coordinating with incoming support aircraft and ground forces while maintaining surveillance of the village below. The situation was becoming increasingly complex as more Taliban reinforcements began arriving from neighboring areas. Fast movers inbound, Thompson reported. ETA, 15 minutes. We need to mark targets and maintain eyes on civilians. Rivera acknowledged while continuing to engage Taliban fighters who were attempting to use the villagers as human shields. The rules of engagement required him to be absolutely certain of his targets, which meant passing up several shots where civilians might be endangered. Through his scope, he watched a group of Taliban fighters attempting to force their way into houses where families were sheltering. The soldiers were clearly planning to use the civilians as cover for their own movement, a tactic that would make Rivera's job nearly impossible. A particularly bold Taliban fighter made a dash across the village square, apparently trying to reach al-Mansuri's body and retrieve something from the dead lieutenant. Rivera tracked the running figure through his scope, waiting for a clear shot that would not endanger any of the villagers who were still moving through the area. The shot was perfect, taken at a moment when the target was completely isolated in the center of the square. The Taliban fighter dropped immediately, his body sliding to a stop just meters from al-Mansuri's corpse. Whatever he had been trying to retrieve would remain with the dead lieutenant. Rivera was starting to feel the effects of sustained precision shooting. Each shot required complete focus and control, and the stress of making life and death decisions under combat conditions was taking its toll. His heart rate remained elevated, and sweat was beginning to affect his grip on the rifle despite the cool mountain air. Thompson tapped his shoulder and pointed toward a new threat. A Taliban technical vehicle had appeared on the road leading to the village, mounted with a heavy machine gun that could pose a serious threat to both the villagers and the sniper position. The vehicle was moving at high speed, kicking up a cloud of dust as it approached the village outskirts. Rivera swung his rifle toward the new target, but the vehicle was moving too quickly and erratically for a precise shot at the crew. Instead, he aimed for the engine block, hoping to disable the vehicle before it could reach the village and bring its heavy weapon to bear. The .50 caliber round punched through the Technical's hood with devastating effect, causing the engine to seize and emit a cloud of black smoke. The vehicle veered off the road and crashed into a ditch, its crew scrambling to escape before the fuel tank might explode. But the Technical's arrival signaled a disturbing development. Taliban reinforcements were beginning to arrive in the area, drawn by the sound of gunfire and radio communications about the attack on their comrades. What had started as a mission to protect a small village was rapidly escalating into a major engagement. Rivera could see additional vehicles in the distance, approaching along multiple routes. The Taliban response was coordinated and swift, suggesting that this area was more important to their operations than American intelligence had realized. The presence of the shadow in this location was clearly no coincidence. Multiple vehicles approaching from the south, Thompson reported. Count at least 4 technicals, and what looks like a supply truck. We're about to have a lot more company. Rivera felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being outnumbered in enemy territory. This was what he had trained for throughout his career. The moment when superior skill and equipment would be tested against overwhelming odds. The Navy SEALs had built their reputation on winning exactly these kinds of impossible fights. The incoming aircraft would help even the odds, but Rivera knew that close air support in a village environment was extremely challenging. The pilots would face the same constraints he did regarding civilian casualties, which would limit their effectiveness against targets that were mixed in with the population. Through his scope, Rivera could see Hassan and several other village elders helping to evacuate civilians from the most dangerous areas. The old man was showing remarkable courage under fire, exposing himself to danger in order to guide his people to safety. It was exactly this kind of bravery that had made him such a valuable intelligence asset. A new muzzle flash appeared from a rooftop about 300 meters away. A Taliban sniper had taken position and was attempting to locate Rivera's hiding spot among the rocks. The enemy shooter fired several rounds that struck dangerously close to Rivera's position, indicating that his concealment was becoming less effective. Rivera immediately shifted his aim to the rooftop, scanning for his counterpart through the rifle scope. Sniper duels were among the most intense forms of combat, requiring absolute precision and nerves of steel. The first to make a mistake would likely be the last to make any mistake at all. The Taliban sniper made his location known with another muzzle flash, and Rivera responded instantly. The heavy rifle bucked against his shoulder as the .50 caliber round crossed the distance in less than a second. Through his scope, Rivera saw the enemy sniper's weapon tumble from the rooftop, followed by the fighter himself. But the engagement had revealed Rivera's position more clearly, and several Taliban fighters were now directing coordinated fire toward his rocky hiding spot. Bullets were striking close enough to shower him with stone fragments, and it was becoming clear that the position would soon become untenable. Thompson was already packing up the spotting scope and other equipment that would be needed for a tactical withdrawal. The sniper team had accomplished their primary mission of protecting the villagers, but remaining in their current position much longer would likely result in their capture or death. "Time to move," Thompson said quietly, slinging his pack and preparing to provide security during their withdrawal. "The cavalry is almost here, and we've done what we can from this position." Rivera took one last look through his scope, searching for any sign of the shadow among the chaos in the village below. The Taliban commander had vanished completely, probably escaping into the network of caves and tunnels that honeycombed the mountains in this region. The mission to eliminate the shadow had failed, but the intervention had saved the lives of Hassan and the other villagers who would have been executed as examples to the wider population. Sometimes in war, victory was measured not by enemies killed but by innocents saved. Rivera began his tactical withdrawal from the sniper position, moving carefully among the rocks while Thompson provided overwatch. The Taliban fighters in the village were still trying to locate their position, but the approaching sound of jet engines was beginning to change the tactical situation dramatically. The first F-16 appeared as a speck in the sky, rapidly growing larger as it approached the village at high speed. The pilot would be coordinating with ground controllers to identify targets while avoiding civilian casualties. A complex challenge that required split-second decision-making at 500 miles per hour. Rivera and Thompson reached a secondary position about 200 meters from their original hide site, giving them a different angle on the village, while providing better concealment from the Taliban fighters who were now actively hunting for them. From this new vantage point, Rivera could see the full scope of the battle that was developing below. Taliban reinforcements had reached the village outskirts and were deploying in tactical formations around the perimeter. Their numbers had grown to at least 30 fighters, supported by several heavy weapons, and the mobility provided by their technical vehicles. What had started as an execution squad had become a significant military force. The lead F-16 made its first pass over the village, flying low and fast to demonstrate American air power to the Taliban fighters below. The psychological effect was immediate, with several fighters abandoning their positions to seek better cover from potential airstrikes. Rivera used his radio to communicate directly with the flight leader, providing ground truth about enemy positions and civilian locations. His perspective from the mountainside gave him a unique view of the tactical situation that would be invaluable to the pilots trying to engage targets from high altitude. Striker 1, this is Overwatch. I have eyes on multiple enemy positions in the village. Be advised, civilians are still moving in the area. Recommend extreme caution on engagement criteria. The pilot's acknowledgement was crisp and professional. These were experienced combat aviators who understood the complexities of close air support in populated areas. They would engage only when absolutely certain of their targets and the absence of civilian casualties. Rivera watched through his scope as the Taliban fighters attempted to use the confusion and civilian presence to escape from the village. Several were trying to reach their vehicles on the outskirts, while others were attempting to blend in with the civilian population. One group of fighters was moving toward the mosque, where many villagers had taken shelter. Rivera could see their intention clearly. They planned to use the religious building and its civilian occupants as a shield against air attack. The tactic was both militarily sound and morally despicable. Rivera aimed carefully, waiting for a moment when he could engage the fighters without endangering the civilians they were approaching. The shot would be difficult, requiring precise timing and absolute accuracy to avoid hitting any of the villagers who were still moving in the area. The opportunity came when one of the Taliban fighters separated slightly from the group to check a side street for threats. Rivera's shot was instant and decisive, dropping the fighter before he could rejoin his comrades or threaten any civilians. The remaining fighters in that group immediately scattered, abandoning their approach to the mosque and seeking individual cover throughout the village. The death of their comrade had reminded them that the American sniper was still active and still deadly accurate. Thompson was monitoring the tactical frequency as ground forces finally began arriving in the area. The quick reaction force was approaching from the south, while additional units were moving to block Taliban escape routes through the mountain passes. The net was finally closing around the surviving fighters. Rivera felt a grim satisfaction as he watched the tactical situation develop. The Taliban forces that had come to execute innocent villagers were now trapped in an increasingly desperate situation. The hunters had become the hunted, and the odds were rapidly shifting in favor of the Americans and their Afghan allies. But somewhere in the mountains above, the shadow remained free to plan and execute future attacks against American forces and their local allies. The primary mission had failed, even though the immediate threat to the village had been neutralized. Rivera knew that this fight was far from over. 3 weeks after the village battle, Rivera found himself back in the same mountain range, but this time the mission parameters were entirely different. Intelligence had finally located the Shadow's primary hideout, a complex of caves and bunkers carved into a remote peak that had served as his command center for over 2 years. The information had come from Hassan himself, who had pieced together fragments of overheard conversations and observed movement patterns to identify the location where his son's killer had been hiding. The old Afghan's network of informants had finally produced the intelligence that conventional surveillance had failed to gather. Rivera was part of a larger operation this time, working with a full SEAL team and Afghan special forces in a coordinated assault on the mountain stronghold. But his role remained the same: provide precise long-range fire support and eliminate high-value targets as they presented themselves. The approach march had taken 2 days, moving only at night and hiding during daylight hours to avoid detection by Taliban spotters. The terrain was even more challenging than the area around Coast Village, with steep cliffs and narrow passes that made movement both difficult and dangerous. Rivera had established his position on a rocky outcrop, approximately 1,200 meters from the cave complex. The distance was at the extreme range of even his advanced equipment, but it provided the concealment necessary to avoid counter-sniper fire while maintaining visual surveillance of the target area. Through his scope, he could see the elaborate defensive positions that the Shadow had constructed over months of occupation. The cave entrances were protected by sandbags and camouflage netting, while interlocking fields of fire had been established to cover all possible approaches to the position. Thompson was beside him as always, but this time they were supplemented by a forward air controller and a communications specialist who could coordinate with the multiple elements involved in the assault. The operation represented months of planning and preparation, with backup plans for every conceivable contingency. The attack began precisely at dawn, with the main assault force approaching from the eastern slope while Rivera provided overwatch from his distant position. The initial movement was conducted in absolute silence, with the SEAL team using hand signals and night vision equipment to navigate the treacherous terrain. Rivera watched through his scope as the first Taliban sentry was eliminated by a suppressed rifle shot from less than 50 meters away. The SEAL assault team was moving with the deadly efficiency that had made them legends among special operations forces worldwide. But the Shadow's defensive preparations were more elaborate than intelligence had indicated. As the assault team approached the first cave entrance, a series of improvised explosive devices detonated simultaneously, filling the mountain air with smoke and debris, while alerting every defender in the complex. The carefully planned stealth approach instantly transformed into a violent firefight as Taliban defenders emerged from concealed positions throughout the cave complex. Machine gun fire swept across the rocky slopes while RPGs exploded against the stone faces of the mountain. Rivera immediately began engaging targets as they appeared, his heavy rifle adding its distinctive thunder to the chaos of battle. Through his scope, he could see muzzle flashes erupting from multiple cave entrances as the Shadow's fighters attempted to repel the American assault. The first target was a machine gunner who had taken position near the main cave entrance and was raking the assault team's approach route with devastating fire. Rivera's shot silenced the weapon permanently, allowing the SEAL team to advance to better cover among the rocks. But the Taliban defense was more organized than anyone had expected. Additional fighters appeared from concealed positions, establishing overlapping fields of fire that pinned down the assault team and threatened to turn the attack into a costly failure. Rivera could see through his scope that the Shadow himself had appeared at one of the cave entrances, directing the defense with calm professionalism despite the chaos surrounding him. The Taliban commander was wearing modern tactical equipment and carrying what appeared to be an advanced radio system. The opportunity for the shot that Rivera had been waiting for months finally presented itself. The Shadow was standing in a partially exposed position, directing his fighters and apparently feeling secure in the knowledge that no sniper could engage him from the surrounding terrain. But the Shadow had underestimated both the range of Rivera's equipment and his skill with the Barrett rifle. At 1,200 meters, the shot would require perfect compensation for wind, elevation, and the target's potential movement. It was a shot that few snipers in the world could make with confidence. Rivera settled into his firing position, controlling his breathing and heart rate while calculating the numerous variables that would affect the bullet's trajectory. The wind was relatively calm, but the extreme range meant that even minor atmospheric conditions could cause a miss. Through his scope, the Shadow appeared surprisingly small, a figure barely distinguishable from the rock and shadow of the cave entrance. Rivera had to use every bit of his training and experience to maintain a steady sight picture on a target that seemed almost insignificant at such distance. The crosshairs settled on their target as Rivera began his final breathing sequence. Everything that had led to this moment, the death of Hassan's sons, the planned massacre at Coast Village, and years of Taliban attacks against American forces, was about to be answered with a single, precisely delivered round. Rivera's finger found the trigger as he prepared for the most important shot of his career. In his scope, the Shadow continued directing his fighters, unaware that judgment was approaching from across the valley at over 2,000 feet per second. But just as Rivera reached the final pressure point on his trigger, the Shadow suddenly stepped back into the cave entrance, disappearing from view as if he had sensed the approaching danger. Rivera held his fire, frustrated by another missed opportunity to eliminate his primary target. The firefight continued to rage around the cave complex as the SEAL assault team worked to neutralize the defending Taliban fighters. Air support was limited due to the close proximity of friendly forces to enemy positions, forcing the battle to be decided by small arms fire and individual courage. Rivera continued to provide precision fire support, eliminating Taliban fighters as they exposed themselves to engage the assault team. His shots were having a decisive effect on the battle, systematically reducing the enemy's ability to maintain their defensive positions. Through his scope, he watched as SEAL team members moved with incredible skill through the deadly terrain, using explosives and close-quarters combat techniques to clear cave after cave of Taliban defenders. The mountain stronghold that had seemed impregnable was slowly falling to American determination and superior training. But the shadow remained hidden somewhere within the cave complex. And Rivera knew that the mission would not be complete until the Taliban commander was confirmed dead or captured. The man who had orchestrated so much death and suffering could not be allowed to escape again. Thompson was monitoring radio traffic from the assault team, providing Rivera with real-time updates on their progress through the cave system. The SEALs had encountered heavy resistance, but were methodically clearing each position with the support of Afghan special forces. Assault team has reached the main cave complex, Thompson reported. They're encountering organized resistance from multiple positions. No sign of the primary target yet. Rivera maintained his overwatch position, scanning continuously for any sign of the shadow, attempting to escape through one of the numerous exits that honeycombed the mountain. Intelligence had indicated that the cave system included several emergency escape routes that could allow the Taliban commander to slip away during the confusion of battle. A movement caught his attention near a concealed cave entrance, about 300 meters to the north of the main complex. Through his scope, Rivera could see a figure in tactical gear emerging cautiously from what appeared to be a natural crack in the rock face. The figure was moving with the careful precision of someone accustomed to avoiding detection, checking multiple directions before committing to movement across the open ground. Rivera adjusted his scope magnification and felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the distinctive profile of his primary target. The shadow was attempting to escape through an emergency exit while his fighters continued to resist the American assault on the main complex. The Taliban commander had timed his movement to coincide with the heaviest fighting, using the chaos as cover for his withdrawal. Rivera tracked the moving figure through his scope, leading the target slightly as the shadow moved across the rocky terrain toward what appeared to be a concealed vehicle position. The shot would be challenging due to the target's movement and the extreme range, but it was clearly Rivera's best and possibly last opportunity. The crosshairs settled on their target as Rivera compensated for wind, elevation, and the speed of the shadow's movement across the uneven ground. This was the shot that would determine the success or failure of months of planning and preparation. Rivera's breathing stopped as he reached the final pressure point on his trigger. Through his scope, the shadow continued his escape attempt, apparently confident that he had successfully evaded American surveillance and would soon be free to re-establish his operations elsewhere. The Barrett rifle's report echoed across the mountains like thunder, announcing the end of a hunt that had lasted for years. Through his scope, Rivera watched as the shadow stumbled and fell, struck down just meters from the safety of his escape route. The Taliban commander tried to crawl toward cover, but Rivera's second shot ended his movement permanently. After years of eluding capture and orchestrating attacks against American forces, the shadow had finally been brought to justice by a sniper's bullet delivered from across an impossible distance. Rivera felt no satisfaction in the kill, only a grim sense of completion. The man who had been responsible for so much death and suffering would never again threaten innocent villagers or American soldiers. The mountains of Afghanistan were marginally safer with his passing. Thompson confirmed the kill through his spotting scope while monitoring radio traffic from the assault team. The news of the shadow's death spread quickly through the cave complex, and Taliban resistance began to collapse as fighters realized their commander was gone. The battle continued for another hour as the remaining Taliban defenders were systematically eliminated or captured. Some chose to surrender when they realized that further resistance was hopeless, while others fought to the death rather than face capture by American forces. Rivera maintained his overwatch position until the cave complex was completely secured and the assault team began their withdrawal. His role in the operation was complete, but the memory of the long-range shot that had finally eliminated the shadow would remain with him for the rest of his life. As the SEAL team prepared for extraction, Rivera took one last look through his scope at the mountain stronghold, where the shadow had planned his reign of terror. The caves that had seemed so formidable were now silent, their defender dead, and their purpose ended. Thompson was already packing up their equipment for the long journey back to base. The mission had been a complete success, with the shadow eliminated and his entire command structure destroyed. It would be months before the Taliban could re-establish effective leadership in this region. Rivera slung his rifle and began the careful descent from his sniper position. In the distance, he could hear the approaching sound of helicopters coming to extract the assault team and their valuable intelligence haul from the cave complex. The war in Afghanistan would continue, with new enemies emerging to replace those who had been eliminated. But for now, the villagers of Coast and dozens of other communities could sleep more safely knowing that the Shadow would never again threaten their families or their cooperation with American forces. Rivera had found his vengeance not in anger or hatred, but in the precise application of superior skill and training. The enemy had whispered fearlessly in the mountains, believing themselves safe from American reach. But they had learned that distance and terrain provided no protection against the deadly accuracy of a Navy SEAL sniper who refused to let evil go unpunished. As the extraction helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, Rivera reflected on the price of freedom and the cost of justice, in a land where both were always under threat. He had done his duty as a warrior and protector, ensuring that those who would harm innocents faced the consequences of their actions. The Shadow had fallen, but Rivera knew that somewhere in the mountains, new enemies were already planning their next attack. The hunt would continue, and when it did, he would be ready.